Welcome to a somewhat special episode of Putschcast that some of you have been waiting for quite a while. In our first episode of Putschcast, we talked about the sudden and unexpected rise of Ahmed al-Shara, now president of Syria. You might have seen him talking at the United Nations and now friends with Trump, the very, very famous Donald Trump. But for him to rise, someone else had to step down, or better, fall. Name is, of course, Bashar al-Assad. As far as we know, he now lives somewhere in hiding in Russia, presumably in an apartment in Moscow. There have been rumors about him being poisoned. There's rumors of him being divorced as well from his well-known English wife. But last time we've heard from Jaron Sutton, who spent quite a bit of time in Syria before the war. He described it as a safe haven for Westerners, as a good place to learn and study Arabic, which he did. However, as we all know, the Arabic Spring broke out. Syria got caught up in the tail end of that. And what followed was more than a decade of civil war, 500,000 people dead. And I'm very glad today to have on the call of Putschcast Luke Waters. And Luke is a former war correspondent, and he visited Syria during the war. And he also had an encounter with Bashar al-Assad in person. Hey, Luke.
Oliver, thanks very much for having me.
And we get to that famous interview of yours in a moment. But just to kick off the interview today with you, and I know you weren't too comfortable because you told me what's the story. And I think for anyone who hasn't worked as a correspondent, it's quite a story to tell and to share. So thank you very much in advance. But what is your connection personally, but mainly professional, to Syria? Obviously the conflict, but also beforehand.
I was working, as you well know, as a journalist at SBS World News, and part of our job was to look at the context of international issues and things that were taking place and try and get an angle from locally. And I guess the Arab Spring around 2010 was pretty big. And, obviously we were working, essentially what you would do would be to get Reuters feeds, one of our affiliates, or CNN or something like that, and then obviously you would have all the vision and interviews from overseas. And you go and try and speak to someone in the community, so say the Egyptian or Libyan community at the time of the Arab Spring, and get some context locally. And so the Arab Spring was ticking along, and there seemed this inevitability, I guess, that Syria was going to be next. I was fortunate enough to go to do a journalism fellowship at CNN in Atlanta in Georgia, and you had to sort of select a topic that was going on in world events and sort of follow it through your fellowship, which went for, I think it was 3 weeks from memory. And I selected the Syrian war because I'd found it was quite interesting the way these different levels of complexity were coming about, both from the government side, but then also the emergence of the various militias and the emergence of ISIS and al-Nusra and these other militias that were emerging in Syria. So I got to sort of see it through the lens of how CNN covered it, and they'd had a correspondent who'd been on the ground over there embedded with rebel groups. And so when I came back to Australia, I was still had this fascination, I guess, with the country and with the crisis and the way it was unfolding. And so set about trying to work out if there was a way I might be able to become more directly involved, and started establishing relationships in the Syrian community in Australia to see if there was any way I could find a link and a way perhaps to get closer and cover it from a personal point of view.
Yeah, working with the diaspora is always very important as a journalist, especially during conflict times. Did people that you spoke to confirm this image of Syria? Because I find what we've learned now is the sheer brutality of the regime in hindsight. I mean, we all knew it was a dictatorship. We all knew there were human rights violations before the war. After all, the Assads have been in power for over 40, even 50 years. It's not quite sure how to pinpoint when they actually took power. But when you spoke to people in exile, so to speak, or emigres, did they confirm the brutality, or did they also have that view it was a stable dictatorship, you could make a living there? Because also we never saw streams of refugees before the civil war. That only all happened during the war.
The majority of people that I spoke to painted a picture along the lines of the one that you described at the start of the introduction to this interview. It was, an incredibly safe and constructive place for people to go. I think education, cultural enrichment and learning and that sort of thing. I remember speaking to a lady who went and embedded herself with a family who lived quite traditionally, and everybody that I spoke to had spoken really highly of the country. And I guess it was a version of Syria that I would love to have seen. Having obviously seen it not at its best, but definitely, though, overlaid by the fact that, it was a dictatorship and people knew essentially where they stood and there were certain things you did and didn't do.
Yeah, and we talked about that in the first episode as well, where our guest said a simple question from a fellow Westerner about how come you have an Assad sticker on the back of your car led to a quick withdrawal from the conversation by the Syrian and said, can't tell you, we just put it on our car.
Putschcast, a global podcast about riots, rebellions, revolutions, and the intoxication of power.
But back to you. So you've done your time, obviously, working as a journalist, from afar. You've done the special training in Atlanta. You made connections here. The war broke out. And then in 2016, you got really close to what happened on the ground. In early 2016, you had your first opportunity to go and cover what's happening there.
I was sitting in my apartment and an email came through. It was reasonably late at night, and it said that my application and request to cover the crisis had been approved by the Ministry for Information, and to reach out as soon as I possibly could. And I obviously, when I woke up the next morning, had to check my phone again to make sure it was true. It was a terrific opportunity, but then I guess started the logistics, the security checks, all the process of how we were going to manage going over there and what actually was going to take place on the ground, how it was going to play out. But essentially, after establishing lots of different relationships, the one which I think was pivotal was there was an honorary consul based in Sydney, and he was the one that was, I suppose, able to open up a direct path for me in the Ministry of Information, which is the one that manages media requests and that sort of thing. And then I was there for a bit over a week, I think, and did a suite of different stories. Obviously, it was very much from the government's perspective, or from what I was allowed to see from the government. I was taken to the front line of the war. I was observed refugee camps and settlements, went to schools and looked at a range of different aspects of life in Syria at the time.
And this is 5 years into the war. 5 years, what was the country like at that time?
I think it was a different country around 12 months beforehand. It was in the aftermath of the Russian aerial invasions, which really did turn the tide of the conflict and really reduced the effectiveness of a lot of the so-called rebel militias and their impact on the ground. So as a journalist embedding with the government of the time, I think it was a safer bet than it would have been 12 months beforehand when these militias had a lot more power. Damascus always managed not to become overly impacted. When you look at the impact of Homs and Aleppo and some of the other city Lib and these other cities and what took place there. There were pockets of fighting in Damascus, but the city itself functioned reasonably effectively throughout most of the war.
And even now you see images out of Damascus after the fall of Assad where people sit in cafes and it looks quite normal, but it must really be isolated, I think. And we'll probably do another episode on that. But the army we've heard so much about, the Syrian army. So we've heard about corruption, people getting paid $30 a month and, officers selling fuel out of their tanks just to support their families. What was the state of the army when you were there? Because you were embedded with them. Were they quite functioning and well organized? What was your impression?
It was interesting that I was taken to a place called Jobar, which I think is eastern Damascus. From memory, it was 15 or 20 minutes from central Damascus, and there was Jaish al-Islam, which was the Army of Islam, was the opposing force where we went. There was some curious characters, including the general that sort of welcomed me. He was very suspicious at first, didn't speak English, but through a translator we established a bit of a relationship, and he went from being a bit standoffish, and then he couldn't be more helpful for whatever reason. The whole thing flipped. I don't know what the translator said, but we were in the back of the truck and going along, and he'd take us to where the basically where the battle was taking place, and explaining about how a lot of the issues were taking place underground. There was a whole web of tunnels underground, which is where a lot of the fighting was taking place. I think it was some statistic like he'd spent 2 days at home in the last couple of years, and he had a relatively young family. Obviously, he was singing very much from Assad's song sheet and the narrative around, freeing the Syrian people of the rebels and what have you. And he was not going to go home until that job was done. The other thing was he had a really quirky experience where after we'd gone and I'd done the filming and interviews and everything, I was about to get out of there, pretty happy to go. There was a few mortars thudding around the place and that sort of thing. And then he invited me in for a meal. And I said, oh, God, don't know that we can do that. And next thing, we're in this bunker and there's a 12-plate Middle Eastern feast in front of us. And he's sitting down. There's an AK-47 leaning up against the wall, and you can hear the mortars in the background. And he reaches under the table, pulls out a bottle of white wine, plonks it on the table, and the translator said, "You've got to stay. You can't go. You've got to stay." So I sat there and had a meal with the colonel, which was funny and awkward. I didn't speak Arabic, he didn't speak English, and we sat there. But that was one of my experiences from the front line.
Arabic hospitality in a very weird context there.
Exactly. Yeah, true enough.
Today's podcast episode is brought to you by Motorcycle Rental Melbourne, your ticket to an amazing adventure on 2 wheels across Australia. Motorcycle Rental Melbourne is your gateway for the most spectacular way to explore the 5th continent. Visit motorcyclerentalmelbourne.com.au to check out the fleet. Don't forget to mention Putschcast for a 10% discount on your next rental. Terms and conditions apply.
The army you just talked about, so they were supported heavily by the Russians on the ground. Did you see that? Was there any reference to Russian involvement?
I think the majority of the support, the meaningful support that they got from the Russians was from the air. I think the Iranian support and the support from Hezbollah was more from ground forces. Again, it wasn't something I observed, but my understanding is that that's the way it worked. I mean, I think places like Latakia and that there was more of an obvious Russian presence, but certainly not in Damascus. It wasn't one I saw. They were passionate. They had head counts around how many opposition fighters they'd killed. These guys meant business. There's no doubt about it. And they would separate their count in rebels, and then they would say how many were ISIS. ISIS was definitely the one they cared about the most at the time.
And again, we're in the mid-2010s. ISIS was the biggest threat in the Middle East. Remember the advance they pursued in Iraq and in Syria as well, making Raqqa their capital for quite a while. The interaction with the soldiers you've just spoken about, great anecdote about the general. Russians were really nowhere to be seen except through constant bombing from the air. The civilians, did you have any exposure to non-military affiliated people, just random families that you met or other people on the street?
Yeah, I mean, certainly on the street, I had the freedom to speak to anyone that I wanted to. That's what I was told. Some of the people I interviewed were people who had lost family members. So I suppose that my objective was to try and humanise, the impact of the war and what have you. When I spoke to people, they wanted their Syria back was the main understandable thrust of what people would say. We just want it to return to what it was. We want our family members to come back. Because you've got to remember, it's not just the people that were killed, but literally in their millions, the people were fleeing for safety, getting over into Lebanon, getting into wherever they could just to free themselves from the fighting.
The horrible injuries inflicted on people, especially through the barrel bombs and other ways of decimating entire suburbs there. The thing to take into consideration as well, which is different to other conflicts, is that it is a civil war, right? So it rips families apart. It rips entire communities, townships, villages apart because one brother stands on this side, the other brother stands on the other side. How's that different to other conflicts where, just like we had in Yugoslavia in the 90s, people were just asked to take a side from one day to the next? Did you have any interviews around that?
One thing that I was told by a few different people was that before the war, they didn't know whether their neighbour or the people over the road or the people with whom they associated were Sunni or Shia. They didn't know. And it was really, the emergence of ISIS that had driven this wedge, this sectarian wedge between families and friends and people and what have you. And really there was little awareness of that divide before really the crisis started to emerge. And that was something that came from quite a few different people. It just wasn't really a factor. I mean, obviously, it's something people were aware of and to a certain extent, but people wouldn't go and ask or necessarily even know.
Especially in metropolitan areas like the ones you've visited, I guess. And that's an angle I never thought of, that because you always hear, the Arabic Spring sweeping in from the west, really starting in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, where ISIS obviously came off from Iraq, and that pressure that people and also maybe the government was under. Assad always claimed, as so many dictators under threat too, that, it's all foreign influence and we're trying to sweep that out again out of our country, i.e. ISIS. But he also obviously wasn't too fond of Western leaders at the time either. How were you treated as a Westerner by the local people? Were they suspicious or were they welcoming and hoping to share their story?
The majority was welcoming, both from the government people, but also from general people that I would introduce myself to or ask the translator to introduce me to. Most people were welcoming of the fact that I expressed an interest in their country and what have you. Obviously, when it came to people who were physically suffering at the time, say in refugee shelters and people who had been displaced from their homes and things like that were living through it, it was important to be pretty careful of their space and the extent to which they wanted to share vision and be filmed and be interviewed and that sort of thing. And there were a couple of occasions where people took exception to that, and some of the time it was purely fear. They just did not want anyone to know where they were because of the potential for reprisals. So obviously that's something that you had to respect.
Putschcast. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram to find out about the latest coup coming your way.
We're speaking to Luke Waters, former war correspondent, talking to us here on Putschcast about his experience covering the civil war in Syria, but also his experience meeting the president face-to-face. President at the time, Bashar al-Assad. You've mentioned before, in 2016, at the start of the year, you got to go and cover the stories we just talked about, but then there was the next level. So you got back to your home base. Was there another email coming from the foreign ministry? How did that famous interview come about?
Yeah, well, it was still through the same line of communication, the Ministry for Information, initially via the Honorary Consul. So it was a phone call this time, notifying me that formal requests to interview the president had been approved and that we would start the conversation around logistics the next day. Quite deliberately, they put a pretty short timeline on the time from being told to the time that we were going to get there and get things done. So I think we had about 3 days to get our stuff organised. And again, do security checks and all the things that we needed to then again go into Syria. So via Beirut, flying into Lebanon, Beirut, and then by car into Damascus.
You've had 3 days notice. How do you prepare for this? This is clearly a highlight of your career, I would assume.
Yeah, well, definitely. And so many considerations as the editorial side of things along the line, like what questions are we going to ask? How are we going to approach this particular interview? And there was an international editor at the time whose suggestion was, okay, our point of difference is that we're an Australian news organisation interviewing Assad, so let's speak some of the communities in Australia that have been impacted by the conflict from all sides and see what questions they would like asked of Assad. Assad's people, so his information ministry again said that we had to provide 5 kind of themes or topics so the president could be prepared for the interview, which some people didn't like, but one of the ones that we put in there was the conflict or the crisis, the Syrian crisis. So I think that was broad enough to capture pretty much any question that we really wanted to ask. And then the other side of it was the logistics again and the reality of, okay, where is security and safety on the ground? don't be fooled by the thought that just because we've been asked by them that guarantees safety. It's not the case, and there are lots of examples of that not being the case. So again, the logistics, the security, the safety, the editorial side, it was a busy few days.
The good thing is you've done it before, you've been there before, so you're probably a bit calmer than the first time around.
Yeah, definitely.
Why the timing? What was Assad's intention around that charm offensive with Western media?
There was a lot of civilian casualties from the Russian aerial assaults that took place the year before. So if you were to guess, you might say that they'd put it was very considered and very strategic the way they managed information and media and that sort of thing, which should come as no surprise. But perhaps it was that enough space had been, for as far as they were concerned, between the aerial assaults, which claimed a lot of civilian lives, but swung the war back in the regime or the government's favour. And at that point, it was probably a worthwhile time to get out on the front foot. So I've often pondered that question myself.
And in English as well. Did you expect that?
Well, I did know that he trained as an ophthalmologist in London, and his English was pretty good. So yeah, he spoke good. One of the weird things he said to me, we had a short discussion where it was just he and I in the room beforehand, which apparently is for us to establish some sort of rapport. And he said I've done my research. He said Australian is, what did he say? He said it's Eastern in location but Western in values, and I think your government is very aligned with the United States. Which for me at the moment is a problem. He said, but I've never met an Australian before. And I thought, that's pretty weird. If you were trained in London, which is crawling with Aussies, I find that pretty odd. But perhaps he just never paid attention to them or whatever. So from his perspective, Australia was totally new, and he had to do a little bit of studying in that as well.
Now, walk us through the lead up to this. So you just talked about how you met him in person. I assume you were picked up at the airport by, did you have a convoy or something? I mean, it's still a country at war, and you had to go to the presidential palace.
Well, yeah, so the way it worked was I used the driver that I'd used on the previous trip, because he, proved to be trustworthy and reliable and what have you. And so he had a car that had was allowed to go both into Lebanon and Syria. So he picked me up at the airport, same car, same thing, through the border control, then lots of checkpoints. So probably 3 or 4 checkpoints, a couple of which we got waved through and a couple of which we had to stop. They checked my equipment, my gear, went through that pretty carefully. So these guys, they're soldiers, they're in the army, but some of them are wearing full uniforms. Some have, Nike boots and sort of half uniforms and that sort of thing. They're smoking. So there's sort of the training and that, the difference between the, frontline sort of soldiers and that sort of thing sort of diminishes. And then the next thing I had the next day was an appointment with his head of media and information, actually at the palace. And so I had to go in there with the producer that was with me, and we travelled to the palace and had to be interviewed by her, the head of media, around the interview, what the protocols would be, how we had to address the president, all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, what were the protocols? You said before you had to submit 5 topics beforehand. Was there any no-go areas for the interview? Anything you couldn't talk about, or any?
They said that. They said there's nothing you can't talk about. We just want to be prepared. And look, to be honest, we never paid that much attention to it. We gave them the 5, but because the crisis was in there, pretty much captured anything. My intention was never to be rude or make it the toughest interview anyone had ever done or anything like that, because I wanted to get home. And there's a reality when you do those things. So, but certainly it was to find out, the perspectives from him. So all she said was, please refer to him, be polite, don't interrupt. And I said, look, if responses are going too long or responses are not direct to the question, I would reserve the right to redirect the president back. And she said, yep, that's fine. That's within reason. But she just asked me to be polite, which I thought, they're asking me to their country to speak to their president. I'm happy to be polite, but I'll still ask the questions that we as a collective at SBS thought were the right ones to ask.
Which you did. We talk about those in a second, but the scenery itself, so presidential palace, is it as glamorous as you imagined it to be? Was there already signs of war at that stage, or was it like an oasis of peace and tranquility?
it was barren. It was like these pillars in the ground that come down and the car drives over it, and there was no one around at all. When we got in there was a few security guards. We went through the security process to meet this head of media, but really it was barren. It's like a big, stark kind of concrete building, not much vegetation or anything like that, and hardly any people around at all. It was just barren and no real even cars parked outside or anything like that. And then, we had the meeting with her, and then the actual interview the next day was at a different place. It wasn't actually at the palace. It was at an office complex in Damascus itself, whereas the palace, from memory, seemed a little bit on the outskirts. Yeah.
So just representational building that for us is alienating, but I guess for someone like Assad, it's representative.
Perhaps, yeah.
And so no sign of his family or children, women? Was it all just military and the president, really?
Yeah, no, we'd put in a request as well to, as you referenced, his wife is quite an intriguing figure in her own right, and we put in a request to have her involvement as well, perhaps to do as a side story and that sort of thing. That was declined. That was before we actually went. That was declined. The only, my understanding was the only family members we observed and met were when we went for the interview the next day. The security detail at that premises where the interview actually took place, there's no uniformed soldiers. These were all guys with leather jackets and automatic weapons, and I was told by someone that that's all his family. So they do the immediate security detail as distinct from the checkpoints and things like that are manned by soldiers. The
Assad clan. Now, you described a moment before the interview, you actually had a one-on-one, no cameras, no one else around, just you and Bashar al-Assad. What goes through your head? Do you think I'm standing opposite this war criminal, this person who's responsible for the deaths of thousands, or do you just focus on your questions and how to get the best information out of him? What's your approach? What's happening inside of you?
I suppose I was nervous, of course, because it was the first time I'd done something like that. And from his point of view, it's just another foreign journalist coming over to ask a slightly different version of the same question. So he's quite accustomed to it. He was quite charming, quite pleasant. But the producer and I were sat down, and then he came out of the lift, and he and I went into the room by ourselves, had the chat for, I don't even think it was 10 minutes. It might have been 5, but it was just I don't think he was asserting himself a little bit by making those comments about Australia and all that sort of thing. And I said, it's a fair observation. And the other thing he said to me during that was, he said, so you don't understand what the impact is of these terrorists. And this is the problem with the West. They don't understand. And I said, with respect, Mr. President, because I'd been doing a lot of stories at the time on, young Australians going over to fight in Syria and Iraq for ISIS and other groups and that sort of thing. And I explained that to him. And I also explained, the fact that we'd had terror attempts and plots at, football games and Anzac Day and that sort of thing. And so I said it's very much something we do understand, even though, of course, we haven't been touched to the same extent as other countries, where the presence is more physically felt.
Yeah, plus the West was fighting ISIS already indirectly through the Kurds, but there was action taken. So you're sitting down, they're obviously controlling the lighting, making sure the president looks good and all that. And then you start your questions, and let's just tune in to the interview and just have a quick listen.
Mr. President, thank you for speaking with SBS Australia.
You're most welcome.
It's now more than 5 years since the Syrian crisis began. It's estimated somewhere around 250,000 people have been killed, many of them civilians. There's an undeniable humanitarian disaster. How far into the crisis do you think you are, and is there an end in sight?
Of course there's insight, and the solution is very clear. It's simple yet impossible. It's simple because the solution is very clear. How to make it discussion between the Syrian dialogue between the Syrian about the political process, but at the same time fighting the terrorism and the terrorists in Syria. Without fighting terrorists, you cannot have any real solution.
Your first opening question to Assad, do you think he was nervous?
No, I don't. I don't think he was nervous. I don't think he saw significant consequences. I think he saw the interview as an opportunity to continue to double down on his message, which essentially is that Syria was at the behest of a whole range of terrorists, and anybody, he despised it being called a regime. As far as he's concerned, it was a democratically elected government in a democratic country, and anybody that took up arms against it was a terrorist, and he would treat them accordingly. So his message was just consistently that. Pretty much to any question, that's where he would arrive back.
Yeah, because it is unusual, that a president under threat during civil war actually bothers to sit down and give interviews. If you think of others, they just sit it out in their bunker. I'm quite impressed, I have to say, that you got to ask any question, that there was no sanctioning or any pressure on you to get his message out there.
Bits were not cut out or edited. It was the interview as it happened.
Okay.
So there was nothing was cut out. If that's sort of just, some people have asked that in the past.
Yeah.
That wasn't the case. And they managed that process, obviously, because they had all the editing equipment and all that sort of thing, and they provided us with a file. And I think we had, I think it went to air about 2 or 3 days after it actually took place. It went to air in Australia.
Which was important at the time because events were unfolding so quickly that, a week or two down the track,
things changed, yeah.
Situation might have changed completely. Now, there are 2 moments in the interview that I want to reflect on. Is one where you ask him about his vision, which is so important as a leader to have, no matter if you're a business leader or a dictator in a Middle Eastern country. And he responded about Syria becoming a safe country again, what we referenced earlier of, the good old days before the civil war. Was that convincing for you? Because sometimes I just wonder, is he just being cynical there? Or does he live in a bubble? Like, what was your understanding? Does he actually believe what he's saying?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't really know. I mean, I know that he does. I think he's calculated and he's cunning, and I think that was proven. His response to that was, well, I'll let the Syrian people judge me in time, in the fullness of time. And I guess judge him they have. And, they now know that he had an escape plan, a very elaborate getaway plan, which he executed. So I think that he 100% believed everything and was honest in his thoughts, I think, I don't. I think he was well schooled by his father, would be my assessment, and I think he was very strategic in the way that he managed the whole thing.
Let's have a quick listen.
What's your vision for Syria? How do you see things in 2 to 3 years?
After the crisis, so the first thing we would like to see is to have Syria stable as it used to be before, because it was one of the most stable country and secure country around the world, not only in our region. So this is the first thing. If you have this, you can have other ambitions. Without it, you cannot.
So that was Assad speaking to Luke Waters in 2016. You just mentioned his training, but the interesting part about him is that he wasn't meant to be the president, right? That's why he was in London. He graduated, and then his brother died, and all of a sudden he became the heir to the throne. Did that come up at all? Was there any in your research, or did that influence the way you phrased your question to make it more personal, not just about the conflict, but about him as a person?
It is fascinating that his brother Bashar was always the anointed one that was going to succeed Hafez, and he'd done significant military training. Understanding of him is that he was a bit of a maverick as well. And he was, I think, going to be going for a skiing trip or something in Europe, and was speeding to the airport and was killed in a car accident. And pretty much straight away, Bashar was summoned back from the UK, where he was studying to be a doctor.
You got to see this in the context of the region, right? So we all know what happened to Saddam. We also saw what happened to Gaddafi. And I think the difference is with those two that obviously they were in power for decades. I mean, he was there for quite a long time in the end as well. But I do think after reading a few books about them, they actually believed in what they were saying. They actually believed their own myth and lie so much as some dictators do, because they surround themselves with yes men and a fabricated version of reality. But I think Assad, especially through his wife and his Western upbringing and spending so much time there, which none of the other dictators in the regions had done, he must have he must have known what was happening and what his role was and what would happen to him, as you said, escape plan. What would happen to him if things go wrong, which they did in the end?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it is fascinating. I mean, I think he was seen as a breath of fresh air for Syria when he took over, and he was going to open the country up and become more, open to people from other cultures. And there was a level of optimism, as I understand from what I've read, around when he did take over power. But obviously he regressed to being very similar, and some would argue worse than his father in terms of being repressive to his own people.
Yeah, because in the end, the civil war was all about preserving power, wasn't it?
Well, that's how it ended up. Yeah, I mean, it was, again, there was this momentum and this so-called inevitability that his regime was going to be the next to topple as part of the Arab Spring, but he wasn't going to have a bar of that, and he saw it coming and circled the wagons and put up a fight.
And the big difference is obviously compared to others, the support to the Russians, which if that wasn't the case, he might have been toppled, and it would have been...
And Iran and Hezbollah as well, I think it's important to point out on the ground, yeah.
It would have been a much sooner ending of his reign, I think, if it wasn't for the foreign support there. Let's just have a listen to the last bit of the interview where Assad answers your question of how history will judge him.
What I wish is to say that this is the one who saved his country from the terrorists and from the external intervention. That's what I wish about. Anything else would be left to the judgment of the Syrian people, but this is my only wish.
Mr. President, thank you very much for speaking with SBS Australia.
Thank you very much.
That was Assad. That was the interview. Interesting point of view there from him. Luke, now, do you get up, shake hands? Thank you very much. Out you go. What happened after the interview?
Yeah, he's gone pretty quickly. Yeah, quick shake of the hands, and that's it. He's gone. Yeah.
Do you know if he watched it?
No, I don't know. I never had any further dealings with the information ministry. The producer, I think the kind of liaison around getting the file of the interview to SBS was handled by someone else, because went straight into Lebanon the next day and was covering stories in Lebanon.
There was some events in Lebanon that were more challenging than the actual Assad interview, I believe.
Within 48 hours of interviewing Assad, I worked pretty closely with a Lebanese journalist, and we had some links into an ISIS cell and some guys that said they were former ISIS operators. And so we're interviewing them, and obviously didn't mention the fact that we were sitting down with Assad 48 hours beforehand. But that was at about 3 a.m. in Beirut, in a pretty dodgy part of the town, and it was definitely a scary experience. But they spoke of their time in ISIS and how they felt about ISIS and how pure it was religiously. They weren't allowed to smoke. But then it turned out that so many of these people were attracted to ISIS because of their vulnerability and that sort of thing. And these guys had been drug dealers dealing in the Bashar Valley. And ultimately they joined ISIS in the start for more money. And they were going around filming the battlefield beheadings and that sort of thing, and uploading them for the ISIS site. And they explained that whole process in pretty grotesque detail.
How, as a journalist, how do you prepare yourself to not been taken advantage of?
Well, I was working with a journalist, a fellow who I'd worked with before in Lebanon and had a great deal of respect and trust for. And we'd spoken at length about how this was going to unfold and where the risks sat and what our potential responses would be and that sort of thing. But there was still a level of risk, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But it was something that we wanted to do, and particularly after having spoken at one side.
Because the issue is with Assad and dictators like that, I imagine they have a clear interest in you being there. They want their story to be told. Yep. It's very strategic by them. At the time, it was still a functioning regime. He was still, had the city under control and wherever you were traveling. But with those sort of rebels, terrorists, whatever you want to call them, ISIS, etc., sometimes they have nothing to lose and they have very, very scary backgrounds, like you just mentioned. And how do you feel? And can I also ask how your wife felt at the time?
It's a good question. I was certainly scared, but I think it's a little bit the same as with the interview with Assad. You let the moment control you, or you control the moment. And it's a little bit the same when you're going into one of those environments. There's things you can do to reduce risk and what have you. And they were things that we were focusing on, certainly, in terms of where we met, how we met, and a whole range of things. When it comes to family, yeah, they were concerned, but I've subsequently become a father, and that's why I wouldn't do that sort of work anymore. That said, I was very aware of the risk and put in as many safeguards as I possibly could throughout the whole process.
And you made it home, and I'm glad that we get to talk today, Luke. Another question I have about this, there's the research side, there's the journalistic side, to make sure that you are as unbiased as you can be. But also there's a mental side to this, which obviously today there's a much bigger focus on there than there was even 10 years ago. And your interviews is almost 10 years old now. And did you have any prep work, any meetings with a counselor or someone like this beforehand to prepare you for this job in the field? Because we come from a very protected Western environment going into a space that is very, very challenging for most of us.
So a lot of preparation. So I'd been through 4 separate iterations of what we call hostile environment training, which is preparing journalists to go into hostile environments, whether they're natural disasters, protests, conflict zones, that sort of thing. And there's a fair spectrum of that training. Some of it is what I would describe as junk training, and some of it is incredibly effective. And so taking the effective training and putting that into play is really important. When it comes to the psychological side of it, from memory, there was no pre-briefing, but there was a debrief that you had access to. And to be honest, I think it happened as soon as I got back. And I don't think I engaged in it as meaningfully as I should have. It's certainly there for you. Your focus at that time is to get the stories done, make sure they go to air and make sure they're all okay. But certainly it's something that's available to you, and made available by SBS, who was my employer at the time.
Yeah, and so personally, in 10 years later, reflection, did it affect you in any way, your work on the ground?
Oh, you can't not. I mean, some of the stuff you're seeing that you're exposed to, if you'd be pretty... You wouldn't be human if it didn't impact you in some way. I think having become a parent subsequently, I think it would have impacted me differently and more if I was a parent at the time. Don't think you can go through that and not be touched or impacted, in some way, definitely.
Putschcast. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram to find out about the latest coup coming your way.
So we've heard about your Assad interview. You've met people from ISIS, and we'll definitely do an episode on that separately. ISIS, there's so much to talk about there. But you've always in your work also tried to have a positive angle as well. And like you mentioned before, capture human stories and glimmers of hope in fields of conflict like that. Is there any story you remember from your time that you captured that might have made a difference?
I think wherever kids are involved, there's a level of optimism, and especially when it's kids being kids, and in a war zone, they'll play with discarded bullets and shells and that sort of thing. Their drawings are pretty reflective of what they see. They're drawing rockets and guns and things like that. There was one school I went to in Damascus where there was a guy, I can't remember his name, but he was basically teaching them music, and he just wanted Syria, again, one of these people that just wanted Syria back to how it was beforehand. But he was making sure the kids understood the power of music, and for him, that was a way of them having some escapism from the reality of their lives. And that was great. They sang songs, and you could see them being kids for just that time while they were singing, because, there's no way you can ignore what's outside and that sort of thing, but just that small amount of time where they were able to sing and smile and that sort of thing, because there was always a funny sort of angle to these songs. The guy was quite clever. He had a guitar and engaged all the kids and that sort of thing, but, you could never really escape there was photos of Assad in the classroom, and then outside, not far away, there were sort of shells of kind of trucks and things like that. So, yeah, but that was probably the one for me. Always the kids was the sort of the little bit of optimism, but particularly that day, because you could just see how joyous they were, and there's no way they could be faking that. It was just a good experience.
Yeah, it is that glimmer of hope that children, the next generation, hopefully have a better start. They obviously don't have a good start to life, but a better future in their lives. Have you followed the conflict since? So obviously there's been a massive change in the political landscape in Syria over the last 12 months. No one could foresee what happened there. What was your response to al-Bashar taking over, a man who ran this little mini state in Idlib, and then all of a sudden took almost, I think it's 70-80% of the country now. So
incredible. The sequence of events, which I think is about a year now since the fall of Assad. The thing that struck me was just how quickly it took place. And people said, Aleppo's fallen. That's one thing, that they'll never get Damascus. That's been fortified, and Assad will never let that happen. And it happened just about as quickly. And obviously we know now that he was arranging plan B. He wasn't all that concerned about it. He just wanted to look after number one and get to Russia and do whatever he's doing over there. So, yeah, I think the thing that struck me about it was how quickly it happened, and how there was no meaningful fight or defence of it after all that had happened over that previous however long it was, since 2011, and then it just finished.
Yeah, world history. That's how it is, isn't it? Sometimes within a few seconds or minutes, things can change. People get on a plane, get out in 11 years of civil war for nothing.
Yeah,
it could have stepped down in 2011, and it might have been a different outcome. That's what we talk about here on Putschcast. And Luke, you've mentioned before you've become a father. You are no longer a war correspondent, and you're no longer a journalist either. Why did you leave the profession? What do you do now?
Well, now I run a communications consultancy, so helping individuals and organisations with their media strategy and their spokespeople, helping prepare them for interviews, incident management, and stakeholder engagement, and those sorts of things. Crisis communications also is a big part of it. So I do that now. I guess the enjoyment and the thrill of journalism for me a lot of the time was through some of the hostile environments that we were able to see and experience. And I think that was a reasonable thing to do, when there wasn't someone else who's relying on me. So, I knew I had to make a change, and that was the direction I went in. And I don't regret it. I remember fondly all of the experiences that I've had, but equally I'm engaged in what I do now, and move on that way.
Thank you, Luke. It's only pesty people like me who make you dig out your old stories, but I think it's such a good story to tell. And you gave us really a good insight into the behind-the-scenes work of a foreign correspondent who has shaped the way we in the West understand and see the conflict in Syria, and also the crisis in Lebanon. And obviously it's still going on. There's no solution to either of them. Is there anything else you want to share with us?
No, just to say thanks for taking the interest, Oliver, and I wish you well with your podcast. I think it's going to be a really interesting one, and I think they're the sorts of things again that people can consume and learn, and it's a great thing.
And if you want to follow up and see more of that interview of Luke Waters with Bashar al-Assad, you just have to go on YouTube. It's been re-uploaded, and just Google SBS Dateline Assad interview, and that's you there. Luke, historic document, and I'm sure people in decades to come will look back at it and see what was said and done. Thank you so much for your time, Luke.
Thanks, Oliver. It was great to be with you.